afternoon, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for joining us here for a wonderful conversation. I am Cecilia O'Reilly, and I'm an advisor to foundations and endowments out of Bernstein's Miami office. And I am joined here today by a panel that gives me some starstruck feeling. I have here today a very good lifetime friend, which is Michelle Perez. Michelle Perez is COO of the Tahirih Justice Center, and she oversees all the strategies that enable Tahirih to deliver on its core values. Prior to Tahirih, she was also in public service at the entity that was formerly known as OPIC, as well as the Veterans Administration. I'd like to introduce as well our panelist, Steve Sarawitz, who is not only founder and chairman of Paylocity, but he's also the trustee of the Julian Grace Foundation, which is his family foundation. He sits on numerous non-for-profit boards as well, and hopefully he will tell us a little bit more about what the Family Foundation does, but it is very active in numerous social economic mobility initiatives globally and creating lasting social reforms. We also are joined by Tahirih board member Maria Sistone, who is a tax, trust, and estate attorney in the New York, New Jersey area, working with individuals, corporations, and also endowments and foundations. And Maria sits also on the board of Tahirih since 2014, having been also secretary to the board, as well as being co-chair of Tahirih's expansion campaign. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce the moderator of this session, which is Claire Gola, who is our national head of endowment and foundation services at Alliance Bernstein. Claire joined the firm in 2010 after work at a community development financial institution. Claire holds a BA from Harvard and her master's from the University of Chicago School of Social Work, so fellow alum. I'm pleased to be joined by all this esteemed panel, and I will give it to Claire to take it away. And I will come back and I'll remind the participants that we do have a Q&A box in the upper right hand of this Zoom. So as we go along, as the conversation stimulates thoughts in the conversation, please go ahead and drop your questions in the Q&A, and we will reserve some 10 or 15 minutes towards the end to address those and cluster them by theme. Claire, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ceci. It's so great to be here today with, as you mentioned, a rock star panel. So I'm really excited. So first of all, I have to say, I was doing a little bit of research, just looking on the Tahirih website, this morning, and I didn't know that Tahirih was a person. So I'm just going to read this because it was so impressive to me and just so amazing. Tahirih was a woman born in 1814 who was an example of women's strength in Persia at a time when most women were kept illiterate and hidden from the public sphere. She was actually executed at the age of 38 for her beliefs. She was an incredibly accomplished person, and it gave, an enormous amount of, detail about her. And it just, it was amazing to me to read about women being hidden from the public sphere, or, it gives me, I guess, a great joy to see a vice president today in our country who is a woman on that front. So not to get political at all, but it is an amazing mission, and I'm excited to jump right in. So what I'd love to start with are some, just introductions a little bit, but framing it around the why behind why you joined Tahirih. Why did you get involved? And so I'm going to start with Michelle. If you could share with us a little bit about the why behind your connection.
Absolutely, and thanks for sharing that. I am also thrilled to be here. It's always fun to talk about the work that we're also very passionate about and have devoted our lives to advancing. And so to be here is just a privilege with every single one of you. So thanks for the invitation. For me personally, I think the story is quite personal. My parents actually came from, my mother from Haiti, my father from El Salvador, during the late 60s, during a time where they themselves were fleeing from political and economic turmoil. So they left their countries for two very different reasons, but found an opportunity to not only meet, but to also raise a family here in the United States. I am Black, I am Latina, I am a first generation professional, which means I'm one of the first in my family to go to college. And I'm proud of being a first generation American. I've served for 20 years in the federal space. I left the federal government from OPIC, which is now the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, with a tremendous record and history of contributing and making the most impact in those spaces. I chose to leave government because of what I found in Tahirih. It was on the front line. It was an organization of individuals, a small but mighty team, 100 people nationwide in 5 locations across the country who are actively dedicated to making a positive impact in the lives of people whose families are no different than mine. And so your origin story, for those folks familiar with comic books, origin stories tell the background of the superhero. Really, Tahirih was one. And I would tell you that the staff and champions and supporters of Tahirih are also superheroes, because we work on behalf of ensuring justice to survivors of immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. It was founded on the Baha'i belief of oneness in humanity, that we have a responsibility and an obligation to relieve the pain. And so ultimately, if one person experiences violence because of their gender, then we have an obligation to do something to make a difference. They have a fundamental right to human justice. There are 5 grounds for asylum, just to give a context: race, religion, political opinion, nationality, and membership in a social group. In 1996, Layli Miller-Moreau, who's the CEO and founder of Tahirih, worked with Fauzia Kasinja of Togo, who was at that moment undergoing a forced marriage and was also at risk for genital mutilation as a consequence of her gender in her country. She escaped to the United States, and as a consequence of a landmark decision on that case, Tahirih came to be. Women, gender was identified as membership of a particular social group. And prior to 1996, that had never happened before. So this was a significant change in how the United States considered asylees and how we could then seek asylum for women in particular who were seeking justice. So since that time, we've served 20,000 clients across greater DC, Houston, Baltimore, San Francisco, and Atlanta. And I've got to tell you, it's been one of the most meaningful experiences. I've only been with the organization a year, but it's been a profoundly impactful year in my life.
That's awesome. What a great, and we have offices and we are doing work in all of those areas. So we need to connect folks from Bernstein with all of your areas. That's amazing with all of your offices. So Steve, it looks like you're not in Illinois right now, I have to say, with that backdrop. You just mentioned, Michelle mentioned the Baha'i Temple. I live in the shadow of the Baha'i Temple. I live in Oak Park, Illinois. That's where I am. I'm live from my guest room where I've been since March. Steve, I do love your background. It's great. It gives me joy to see beautiful weather. So if you could share with us a little bit, I mean, you've gone on this unbelievable path from entrepreneur to really humanitarian philanthropist. I mean, if you could just share a little bit about how you found Tahirih and your connection there.
Well, my connection to Tahirih is Tahirih and the Baha'i faith. I happen to be a Baha'i. I started a company called Paylocity, which went public in 2014. And at the same time that was happening, which was a big life change, I was becoming a Baha'i. I had decided to become a Baha'i in 2013. My wife, who's Catholic, I ran home. Actually, my wife, Michelle, is very much like you. She's Hispanic and Black, and she's Honduran. So she's very, very similar. And she looks a little bit like you, but older than you. I won't tell, don't tell her. Anyway, my wife said, well, you're the Jewish one. You can't become a Baha'i yet because the kids are getting a bar mitzvah in 2.5 years. So I was waiting to become a Baha'i. And as my company was going public, I called up a man by the name of Bill Strickland, and I said, I want to do something for the people of Chicago. I don't like the fact that there's all these shootings in Chicago. There's 22 last weekend, 22 the weekend before, and I want to do something. I don't know what to do. I know I saw you speak 5-6 years ago. I know you built these centers. I'd love to build one of these centers in Chicago, which we did. It's called Shy Cat. About 5 or 6 conversations in, Bill says, I'm looking to build a center in Akko, Israel. And I almost fell out of my chair because that is Akko is the spiritual center of the Baha'i faith. Pictured behind me, this is the Baha'i Garden, as they call it, or the Shrine of the Bab in Haifa, Israel. And just right next door is Akko, and that's where we built our center. I walked in the garden of where the Shrine of Baha'u'llah is. And by the way, November 12th today is traditionally the day we used to celebrate every year Baha'u'llah's birthday. So it's kind of a special day. Anyway, I walked into that garden, one person walked out another, and I was a Baha'i less than 6 months later. In the course of that, I met the wonderful superhero Layli Miller, as you mentioned, one of my heroes. And we usually have a lot of people call us and say, give us money. In this case, we actually called Layli and said, we love what you do. We love who you are. We'd like to work with you. And we did. And my wife, who's somewhat skeptical of my crazy ideas, was a little skeptical of the Tahirih Justice Center until she met Layli, and they became fast friends. And my wife was very quickly convinced that this organization was an incredible organization. And we are huge fans of Tahirih Justice Center. I also want to say there's a huge connection time-wise between the woman, the actual Tahirih, and women's rights. The very first women's rights convention happened just days after Tahirih announced in 1848 that this was a new age, and one of the things in the new age would be absolute equality for women. Just days later came Seneca Falls, New York, the very first women's rights convention. And as part of me becoming a new Baha'i, 3 days into my becoming a Baha'i, it was suggested to me by a friend to make a movie. So that became a 3-year odyssey, and I made a movie called The Gate, Dawn of the Baha'i Faith, and one of the stars in that movie is Tahirih. So
Wow.
I could talk all day, but you don't want to.
It all comes full circle. I was, that your background gave me joy. I didn't know, I thought it was just the weather, but now that's so cool that it brings so much meaning to it. So thank you. And thank you for that, walking through that with us. Maria, you are a board member of Tahirih. And so what drew you to the organization, and what's your story in terms of your path with Tahirih?
Well, picking up on what Michelle started to speak about, I'm a child of an immigrant family as well, but what Michelle said conjures an idea that I had from, I think it was the 1990s, when Layli actually argued that case as a law student. And that was the groundbreaking seminal case that began the Tahirih Justice Center. And I remember reading that because I'm from New Jersey, and that was so groundbreaking that I'm actually thinking of it. And I got tears in my eyes when Michelle was speaking, one, because I am from an immigrant background, but also because I remember that case, and about a decade later, opponents of legislation that Tahirih was propounding, and that Layli and people like Jeannie Smoot were integral in writing. It was, I believe, international marriage broker legislation. Their opponents were threatening Layli, I believe. And I was so inspired by young attorneys being so committed to an organization, and yet they just kept pressing ahead. And I thought, that's the type of organization that I want to get behind. I want to partner with them. Those are my kind of people. And that's when I became more and more involved. And we're in the mid to late, 2007, 8, 9, about then. And the rest is history, because once you get to know them, you love them more, because it's not a cult of personality. Then you start to realize each person is very much like that. They're all in that same mold, but everyone is so different. There's a consistent commitment to excellence. You heard just one of them, but they're replicated. Everyone is very much like that.
That's fantastic. Great, different, such variety of stories. That's wonderful. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and move to, and I almost dread doing this, I've been asked to talk about 2020. I just want to move past 20. I just want to go, can we just get in a time machine and go into the future? But look, I manage a business that oversees, hundreds and hundreds of relationships with nonprofits and foundations across the country. And I have to say, I've been through countless conversations since March around cash flow and contingency planning, right? I mean, that's just been, in the business that we're in, and simultaneously conversations with foundations, many private family foundations actually, who are looking at, what will the effects be, for instance, on our, long-term asset value if we give more now? Like, what can we, and how should we be thinking about giving? We need to be doing more now. So, like, today is the rainy day, right? So I'd love to hear from you, because my understanding is that Tahirih has really navigated successfully through this time period. And there are a number of other people associated with not-for-profit organizations in the audience. So I'm going to start with Michelle. What has this time really meant for you? I mean, you have both the, operationally as a nonprofit institution trying to do business, and then you have the disproportionate effect on the populations that you serve. So if you could touch on, both of those, just how you've navigated through this, that would be great.
No, sure. And yes, 2020 has been a year. I'll start by saying, I think it's interesting, the nature of the work that we do. We need to be trauma informed. People who are coming to us likely at the most difficult moments of their lives. And so being responsive to the trauma that they've experienced and may actually be continuing to undergo has really given us a lens to really approach the work that we do. So it's not simply safety planning and risk planning for our clients to help them move through a moment in their lives that they will get past, but need our support in so doing. At the same time, from an operational perspective, we've launched into enterprise risk management in a way that as an organization, we've never really had to approach those concerns. The rainy day is always sometime in the future. You have time to prepare for that. And in this moment, I would say the realization of what this risk in this moment is so far beyond anything we could have expected. And it was so rapid, right? So those are the two crises that we're facing: how we deliver services to our clients, but how we continue to operate the organization in the midst of such chaos. So I'll say, from the client perspective, isolation, and in many cases, a desperation of their situations, because the COVID pandemic, that isolation and lockdown created highly volatile situations that they could in effect not escape from. The UN was recently quoted as saying it was a horrifying global surge in domestic violence in both developed and poor nations. No country was immune to this. And the reality is, for our clients, the asylum cases that they undergo, as an example, a U visa for a victim of a crime who is seeking an asylum, it takes 4 years just to get on a wait list. And even after you get off the wait list, it takes another several years if you're lucky enough to be granted that U visa. So the backlog and the desperation and the need of the moment was just seriously compounded. I mentioned my background. I think it's important to note that the CDC reports that COVID, and we all may be aware at this point, has a disproportionate effect on people of color, right? The social determinants of health, the environment, the socioeconomic status, the communities, the dense populations in which we live. I mean, all of these contribute to the fact that our clients are at risk. They're at they're vulnerable to this. And the jobs, when the doors shut, the economic impact. So many of our clients, if they're able to work, if they have work authorizations, are working in the service economy. So hotels, restaurants, right? All the places that in fact shut down. And so our need for housing assistance and rental assistance, multiplied exponentially, 370% increase, like that. Food insecurity. So not just short-term, but long-term food insecurity, 300 and 530% increase. So that was the reality on the ground in terms of the crisis in how we worked with our clients. I would tell you the effects on Tahirih was interesting because even though the courts were closed, deadlines still existed. And so we didn't know if the courts would open. So we've got whereas we had 5 points of operation, we now had 100 points of operation in everybody's home. And so to ensure that folks were getting the information they needed, that they were preparing for the deadlines and virtually interacting and gaining the trust of our clients, which is a hard thing to do in general, but especially in a distance environment, that was really important, as well as ensuring that we have really great relationships with our pro bono networks, right? Our partners that are spread out who do co-counsel with us on these cases, over 3,000 of them. It was important for us to maintain our relationships with them. So for me, where I sit in the organization, the funding sustainability, resetting our 2020 goals, what's really happening on the ground, really looking at 2021, how long, we're talking about V, we're talking about U, what are we talking about next? But looking out into 2021 to determine the sustainability of the organization, looking at management and board and our board reserves. The reality was, if this is not a rainy day, then what is? And let's have a practical conversation about what we need in terms of cash flow and liquidity. And we exploited, and I'm going to use that word because I think that was the intent of the CARES Act, the payroll protection program. Once we saw that it was available to us, we expended no effort, and it was not easy to go through bank after bank after bank. It was such a hot commodity when it first came out that it was impossible to even get an application in.
Yeah.
We were, we jumped for joy when we got the news that we got it. And I'll say all this at the same time with our staff who are undergoing this crisis. There were fires in California. Our staff literally had to move out of San Francisco because their homes were in danger. Hurricanes in Texas, right? All this has been happening in the last couple of months. So we've also had to balance that with recognizing the needs of our workforce, and also applying an equity lens, a racial justice framework, not just in the work that we do, but what we do within the organization, our interpersonal relations.
Yeah, that's it's a lot.
Yes, it is.
And you just brought up though that whole sort of the perfect storm, right, of all of these different intense issues going on simultaneously this year. I'm actually going to turn this question to Steve. I mean, we've, in addition to the global pandemic and the disproportionate effects on certain communities, and as you mentioned, natural disasters essentially happening, across the country, and then the struggle around race in America, in particular, coming to, I would say, the center stage in a way that we probably haven't seen really since the civil rights movement. With all of these things culminating, I know we were having a lot of conversations with foundations that we work with about how they would navigate. I'd love to hear, Steve, your thoughts on what was your process and how did you think about, as a foundation, as a funder, navigating this environment?
Well, we put aside an extra couple $1 million. We had a couple $1 million for a rainy day, and it was, as Michelle was saying, raining a little bit. So we actually approached our nonprofits and said, we think you might need some extra money now. Would you like some? And we ended up doing a special grant making process. By the way, this is all my wife's doing. I had nothing to do with it. And Allison Lopez, who runs our foundation. And I was all in favor of it. And the board members spent a lot of time, a little extra work, taking the time to analyze these new grants. And we gave out all that money and helped our nonprofits. We did not try to go out to new nonprofits because we had our hands full just with the existing ones. What's interesting is all the things that you mentioned, our foundation was already fighting. We're fighting sexism, we're fighting racism, and we were. That's our we were founded to do that. We were founded, if you know a little bit about Baha'i is against sexism, against racism, against nationalism, against religious prejudice. And those things are really in the founding charter of our foundation. So the things we were doing already put us right in the middle of the storm. And we've since actually put a little bit more money into anti-racism, and so that's kind of, so we really have kind of stepped into it a little bit more and saying, okay, now's the time. We're at this key key point. This kind of point where we can go backwards or forwards. I think we have a chance to go forwards right now in terms of racism. It's not going to be easy. There's going to be people who don't like the change, who are going to fight it tooth and nail, especially because I think we're making progress. And so one of the signs of progress against racism is actually increased racism. This doesn't seem logical, but it's counterintuitive. But as you start taking the territory, the enemy fights back more. And so I think you're going to see a lot more public racism as racists feel like they're back on their heels. And what we need to do as anti-racists, white allies like me, people who are fighting this, is to step up our game. And the other thing that's very, very clear from the Baha'i writings is that we have to do it with an atmosphere of love and unity, not with conflict and contention. It's not us versus them. This is about us being one human family. So our foundation is kind of just expanded what we were already doing.
That's great. No, and you're known for promoting and advocating the elimination of all these isms, right? Racism, sexism, all of these things. So it's amazing that you were already doing the work. So thank you for that. And stepping it up at a time. You make some really interesting points. It's going to be really, really difficult, I think, moving forward. But I agree with you. I think that we're at a point where there's opportunity, ahead. We're really at a great point. Maria, I'm going to turn to you now. Both as a board member for Tahirih, I'd love to hear your perspective on what you've seen at the organization from a board, member's perspective. What have been some of the concerns and observations and really opportunities perhaps that you've seen coming out of this? But I also want to touch on your day job. Also, you're an estate planning attorney as well, right? So I think these are very interesting times in your day job, and I want to tie those together. So first, let's hear about you from a board member's perspective.
Yeah, I think from a board member's perspective, we have been just awed by the tenacity of everyone to stay mission-minded during COVID. I mean, they're just consistently excellent on a regular day. But during this time, they really had an emergency preparedness. And I think it's due to the leadership and due to this obsessive ESG that Michelle put in place. And I think that helped weather it. I'm a little obsessive about long-term planning as well. That's why I constantly talk about, estate planning. Yeah. But for sustainability, I think we were amazed that they started working remotely and consistently. And, running a law firm, it's hard enough. To think that they did this with a population that's scattered, that is vulnerable, that very often lived with their abusers, that was just mind-blowing. And to do it and to make trips and to go out during COVID and personally get items from stores. I mean, they walk the walk. And when we hear these stories, this is a very transparent organization. And so I think from the board's perspective, when I say to a couple of the folks, I think what really drives me is knowing that when I get done with any task, whether it's huge or small, if I feel like I've done my job, if one person goes to bed with a little less anxiety, then I know I've done my job. And I think I speak for the other board members as well. But I'm expanding that now. I think it's knowing that the employees feel a little bit more secure that we have their backs too. Because I think I can speak for my fellow directors that we really want them to know we have their backs as well. This COVID has really highlighted that for everyone. And I'll be respectful of the time as well. as far as my day job, it's been very curious. I think the one thing that's changed, I mean, more of charitable trusts. I mean, I'm just like, you know, a big advocate of long-term planning for any organization. I think what folks are really concentrating on more now is externalizing and giving a voice to what they've been thinking, you know, and it's the job of people like you, people like Cecilia, people like me to help figure out what seizes your imagination. Like, what are you thinking about? You know, we like to use these different aphorisms like what gets you out of bed in the morning, but it's more than that, right? It's what seizes your imagination, what's locked in there, like when you're helping a kid with a book report but not doing it for the child. What are you thinking about? Who are the characters? So what is the mission? And I think once you get the mission, then you know. And so people like Cecilia, people like Claire, people like me become the translators. We just translate it into documents. They translate it into numbers. People like Renee and Carrie and Michelle, they can do the Tahirih side. But I think what we're hearing more now is the long-term sustainability of a legacy, but we're also hearing more of lifetime legacy. They want to make an impact now. Not that give back, I want to give back to my community. I want to know that I matter. I want to make a difference now. What do I want my life to look like? What do I want my kids to see that I have done for this world that I live in? Not that I'm good just to my neighbors, not that I've just given to my school or to a local hospital, which is wonderful, by the way. I'm a big advocate of that. But what else can I do to make this world a better place? Think about those things too. And that's what I see more of.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel like I can give a little value added to Tahirih, because these kind of issues aren't fun. They're messy, but they're so critical, so critical.
Yeah, that's great. No, thank you, Maria. And what you're seeing is exactly what we are, right, seeing, is that the silver lining, I think, of this this pandemic is that a lot of families who are in a positive situation, right, are together as well and spending more time together. And to your point, I mean, the Chronicle of Philanthropy just put out, there's sort of a special report on charitable giving during the pandemic. And a number of organizations have seen, I know it's like a 20% increase in giving from foundations and individuals and corporations in the first half of 2020 versus, 2019. We're certainly our family engagement group at Bernstein, really, who work with families on what makes a successful family across generations. How do we honor the integrity of the initial mission that G1, grandma or grandpa or mom or dad, whoever, set out with their foundation? How do we keep that alive and maintain that integrity, but allow the next generation to express that in a way that is relevant to them and, the world today, right? So there are all these conversations that are going on that are just, we've seen our business change. Our tagline, and we kind of joke about it sometimes, but our tagline at Bernstein is making money meaningful. And I can't think of a time historically where that wasn't more true than today, and where more clients are demanding that of us, whether it's with their investments in terms of aligning their investments with their values around responsible investing, or whether it's with charitable giving and taking advantage of, certain aspects of the CARES Act this year, for instance, or, how do we pair income generating strategies with, giving away 100% of our AGI or whatever those sorts of things are. It's just, there's much more we want to see impact today also. And so that actually leads me to, I just segued in and I wasn't even planning it, a last question, right, that I have for each of you. And it's really, impact is a buzzword, right? We all hear it, sort of throughout philanthropy and the nonprofit sector all the time. I think it means very different things to different folks. But I guess I'm going to start with Michelle. In how are you at Tahirih measuring impact or connecting with donors? How are you sharing that message around the impact that you're creating?
And that's the number one question that we face and think about and reconsider every single day, because the reality is, if we're not aligned in our goals, in what we see as whatever impact means, if we have two very different perceptions, regardless of what the broader lofty goals are, but in terms of what's happening on the day-to-day, how are lives being changed, then it compromises the viability and the longevity of the work that we're trying to do. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so thrilled to be on this conversation with Maria and Steve, because they're such advocates and champions and understand clearly what it is that we're seeking to accomplish. And to be specific, I'm not Baha'i. The vast majority of the workforce at Tahirih are not Baha'i. The vast majority of people who come to us for services don't have an affiliation with the Baha'i faith. But the reality is that they know that we are an organization who will provide that support because we are aligned in the universality of the mission and the message and the world that we are seeking to realize. So with that, specifically regarding impact, it breaks down to the numbers. What are you doing? How are you demonstrating improvements or gains? Or how are you stopping the harm? How are you repositioning a family so that they're not simply receiving a visa, but they're also capable of providing food for their children or a house to live in, right? So this concept of an interdisciplinary model, Tahirih is very special in that respect, because we don't simply staff an office full of attorneys, we also staff an office full of social workers as well, because together they make the support team that makes the impact for the individual and their families. That is a key principle and tenet of our approach to impact. And I can tell you that our work in this year alone, as of the end of October, we're seeing 1,800 unique immigration clients in this year so far. And that's not so different than the numbers that we saw pre-pandemic.
Okay, interesting.
And in terms of wins in 2020, the number of U visas or T visas, visas for trafficking, VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, petitions, asylum cases, juvenile cases, special immigration status for juvenile petitions, and battered spouse waivers. In this year alone, we've seen 101. And I just want to emphasize the length of time for any one case to go through this process spans years. So to be able to actually get to that end of the line and get that waiver or get that a petition granted or the asylum granted, it's a really big deal. And that's 101 people, but far more many lives because of the families that surround these individuals. Wins in family law, these are folks coming to us that need help with divorce, child custody, and child support, because in the instance of domestic violence, in the instance of intimate partner violence, the power dynamics and the ability, the economic independence, much less the legal identification, are crippling. These are situations where, in many cases, the folks who are coming to us for help don't have the resources to provide that support. And I want to say one thing that's particularly special, given what we're talking about. In this year alone, 200 work authorizations have been processed for the people who come to us. So it's not, again, simply getting the visa, but what are all the things that you need in order to make your life the vision that you came to realize in coming to the United States to seek asylum. I'm particularly proud of our workforce. They work, as Maria said, damn hard. And in this year, even in a virtual environment, we did 176 outreach and training events, reaching 13,000 people in a virtual environment. But let me tell you who they are, because it's important to be strategic. They're law enforcement, they're domestic violence shelters, they're the American Bar Association, individuals who have a need to know, a desire to know, or an affiliation with the interests and needs of our clients. So by expanding this message of what information is useful, knowing your rights, that's important. And we also hit the policy piece. That's another area. It's not just training and outreach, it's not just client care, but it's also policy advocacy, because the truth of the matter is, until there's recognition on a national scale of what the impacts of harmful immigration policies are, then we're not going to make a difference. So in one case, when coming to this country, asylees need to be interviewed to determine whether or not they have credible fear. Well, we actually filed and won a national lawsuit that challenged the use of untrained Border Patrol agents who don't have the knowledge, expertise to actually adjudicate credible fear interviews. And we won. Like, this was a big
Yeah.
deal. The actual judge called it poppycock, which was one of my favorite things to see in writing. The last thing I'll say in terms of pivoting and demonstrating impact is innovation. If we simply continue to do that which we have been doing, then we're doing something wrong, especially in this moment. We're missing the mark entirely. So we know that the success rate of claiming asylum without a lawyer is very low, very, very low. But with a Tahirih lawyer is significantly better. So how do we create pro se toolkits so that we can give to folks who work with immigrant survivors of gender-based violence so that they can at least have some resources to engage on their own journeys if they can't come to us for support? We worked with Silicon Valley. There's a consortium of organizations in the West Coast that are looking at our clients' use of technology. Are they using WhatsApp? Do they have cell phones? One cell phone for the family? Like, trying to better understand who in fact our clients are so that we are better positioned to support them. And again, just because I'm the COO, modernizing our IT operational infrastructure, it's not sexy to talk about that when you're looking at, to grantors. But the reality is, if we are not positioned with a modernized, capable, cyber secure, cloud-based security IT environment, then the truth of the matter is we compromise the integrity of the work that we do. And so that has been another opportunity for us to spend real time and effort enhancing. So those are how we look at impact, how we define it and how we measure it.
Thank you so much. So I have to say, I'm so thrilled that you brought up that last piece about operational infrastructure and IT infrastructure, because this is an area where, and I've worked in and around philanthropy for, more than a couple of decades now. And what really, one of my pet peeves is this whole concept of dragging debt, trying to drive down operational expenses. Like, to a certain extent, yes, everybody has to have rational operational expenses, but not at the expense of giving people the tools they need to do their work, right? Like, tax exempt, taxable, whatever. It's the tax code. Like, everyone needs to be able to run a business and run it effectively and efficiently. So, so thank you for sharing that. And I can't leave that. You just rattled off so many amazing statistics from the, numbers perspective in terms of impact. It's hard to even, follow that up. But Steve, I'm going to turn to you as a funder. And this is always it's like the age old question, how are we measuring impact? But I am really curious to hear, as an entrepreneur yourself, and very, a successful one at that, right? Share with us how you think at your foundation about the impact and how you're measuring that for organizations.
So here's a quote for you, Michelle, just something you said. Have you heard this quote before? To be a Baha'i simply means to love all the world, to love humanity and try to serve it, to work for universal peace and universal brotherhood. Have you heard that one? So even though people say they're not Baha'is, from a Baha'i perspective, if someone is doing the work, or to me, an honorary Baha'i. So Tahirih has a lot of honorary Baha'is. And going back to answer your question, the impact for us is to serve humanity. And so if we're serving humanity, philanthropy is, I usually say this, it goes into two buckets. One common one, maybe three buckets. One common one is the Band-Aid philanthropy. There's something that's wrong and it's like a cut, and you bandage it and you feel really good, and then it gets cut again and you bandage it, and it goes on really until infinity. Nothing really happens. You don't move the bar, you make someone feel good for a little while, but you haven't actually changed structurally what the problem is and fixed it. The type of philanthropy we like to do, and we're shifting much more into, and you have to do, by the way, Band-Aid philanthropy, because people are bleeding. The world is bleeding. There's a lot of problems, but the underlying problem are the things I mentioned: the sexism, the racism, the nationalism, the religious prejudice that divides humanity and causes every single war. If you took away the causes of war, if we were united as one human family, that is really the underlying cause of all of our suffering, just about. And so the impact we want to see is a united world. We want to see the underlying problems fixed. We don't want to just bandage it over. We don't want to say, okay, we do feed orphans. We do help foster children. We help female refugees. But I'm a big fan of Malala, And I think she's probably a hero to a lot of you as well, given what she does. She was talking about refugee camps and how it was one of her things is education, which is really neglected in refugee camps. And I think that's wonderful. And we were at a conference, and I think I shocked her because I asked her a question she hadn't thought of, which is I said, how do you get to a world where there's no more refugees? And that's how I think, in a nutshell, is how do we get to the world where we're all living together in peace, where war is no more, where we don't distrust someone because of the country they come from or the color of their skin, one way or another, rich or poor, man or woman, where we're women. This is a big thing in the Baha'i faith. Women and men are wings of a bird, two wings of a bird, where that wing, that second wing, or first wing really, because it starts with the woman, is exactly equal to men, and the bird of humanity can fly full force. So all the impacts we're looking at are really, are we changing the equation? So this isn't just a temporary fix, but it's a permanent fix for humanity.
I think that might be the perfect place to wrap up this portion of the program. I know Cecilia was going to rejoin us and potentially ask some additional questions. So I just want to thank you. Steve, that was really lovely. It's beautiful. And Maria and Michelle, I'm awed by both of you. It's been really a pleasure chatting with you. So from there, I'll turn it over to Ceci.
Thank you. I enjoyed that so much. And we did gather some questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we won't have time to go through them all. But I got one question that was curious, and I think it's a very universal question. People are beginning to, since middle of the year, had to start thinking about 2021. Despite everything that they were triaging, the work is never done. And I'm going to segue using Steve's analogy of the bird of humanity. How are you extending the other wing here to fly over 2021? It sounds like you definitely skated over the ice, but what are you going to do? What does 2021 look like in terms of building capacity and capabilities? And that's Tahirih, but I'd also like to hear a little bit more, Steve, if you would, around some of the other groups and initiatives that you fund as well.
So we fund an initiative called Embrace Race, which is teaching children to be anti-racist. I'm doing a lot of work right now at my university, at my alma mater, funding, basically unifying, it's essentially a unity movement to fight rampant anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, on college campuses, that's become a problem. In the name of justice, which is, I think, a good and meritorious thing, which is justice for Palestinians, it's become hatred of Israelis. And so we don't like any kind of hatred. So we're fighting that hatred, and it's become really vitriolic. I'm funding a lot of things in the anti-racism space. So I won't list them all, but we're doing a lot of things, and we've really amped up. We're doing special funding in the anti-racism space, and that won't change. As I mentioned, we help orphans in actually Central America. We help foster children throughout America we're doing, one of the things I've started doing is funding Baha'i education. So we have some programs that are especially working with African Americans and Native Americans. I believe that in every way, our goal, if you want to talk about the goal of Julian Grace, is to integrate our life into everything we do, integrate it together, integrate our investments. So we invest, we do impact investing. We have a $20 million fund we've put together for brown and Black entrepreneurs and Native American. I'm funding scholarships at my university based on being Black, brown, and Native American. We're talking about doing some anti-racism initiatives at both DePaul, my wife's alma mater, and mine. Everything we do, we want to make coherent and consistent. And our own investments, because even how we invest the foundation's money, it's typically impact investing, or we do ethically screened investments. We will not invest in anything that is not in keeping with the Baha'i teachings, keeping with my wife's Catholic teachings, which are actually, not surprisingly, if anyone knows anything about the Baha'i faith, fairly lockstep. We believe basically everything should be consistent and coherent, and so we do that. And one of the things we do a lot for foundations, Michelle, this will be music to your ears, is we give them investment for their operations, because foundations are always looking, nonprofits are always looking for that. So we are one of the few foundations that says, yes, you can use this for operating funds.
We're so grateful for it. I think I would add to that this recognition of what have we learned in this crisis. What we've learned is we can move with agility, with speed. We can continue to be client-centered. And what does it mean to the future of the work that we do? Historically, we've been focused in 5 locations across the country with an expectation that we're building momentum in those local communities by engaging with partners. And that in a non-COVID space works. It works great because there's a commitment and engagement. There's, yes, a national consideration of who Tahirih is, but there's also the personality of each of the offices from San Francisco to Houston and to Atlanta, and part of those local movements. But I tell you, what we know now is if we can't be at those locations, if we are working virtually, if there's any future scenario that we need to consider looking at a more virtual model, how do we lean into that? How do we create resources? And we're still very much in the strategic thinking place of considering all of the ramifications of what that means, but I'll give you a helpline as an example. To what extent can we provide the support on immigrant issues for domestic violence hotlines? How do we collaborate with other organizations speaking to the racial justice movement who are seeing different clientele from different countries who connect to them because of their affiliations? How do we partner with them so that we can demonstrate the type of collaboration that we want to see with all the communities that need our assistance, so that we're leveraging the knowledge, we're leveraging the resources? So that's, I would say to you, how we're looking at the future, what 2021 looks like, still being conservative, still being strategic, still sort of hunkering down a bit. We're not ready to sort of blast into the future in the way that I think that we were going to before COVID. But that's okay. I think that's the lesson learned, that we can pause in this moment and reflect on what is most valuable, and what do we take from this with us, because some of it will make us better for it. So that's where we're looking.
Great. And with that, I think we're nearly out of time, but one of the questions actually is for you, Claire. And it was around your work across numerous foundations over the years, but more recently, what has, with the recent events and this year in particular, what are you seeing insofar as re-examination of not just portfolios, but your work around governance insofar as diversity and inclusion, as well as ESG? What
yeah. Well, one thing I can share, because I'm also a board member of a private foundation as well in Chicago. One thing that we have learned this year is throughout the year, many foundations have been putting out RFPs or requests for proposals from DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion consultants, right, to really re-examine their operations, everything about the foundation, the grant making, the processes, the staffing, that, just looking at everything in addition to or in conjunction with the mission. It is difficult to get a consultant right now in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, because their business, anecdotally, I've heard, has gone up 300%. In this environment. And so broadly speaking, so that is something that a number of institutions are re-examining. I think a number of private sector companies, obviously, are re-examining, everybody's re-examining, and it's a good thing. So that is certainly something we're seeing. We've also, by far the largest, the fastest growing part of our investment platform at Bernstein is our purpose-driven portfolios, our responsible investing platform, focused very much on environmental, social, and governance factors alongside, traditional financial metrics. But one of the most popular services, or one of the most widely adopted services, is a global equity portfolio that is aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? Really looking at, okay, these are lofty goals, right? And the governments can't do it themselves. Philanthropy certainly can't do it themselves. Like there has to be private sector investment, right? And so looking at companies and getting behind companies that we believe are part of the solution is something that we are seeing across the board, not-for-profits, foundations, people really looking at that other 95% of their portfolio for foundations and how can we align that with the work we're doing in terms of grant making. So does that answer? Yeah.
Thank you, absolutely.
Yeah,
and with that, we are right on time here at the end. I want to close just by thanking each of you, Claire, Michelle, Steve, and Maria, as well as all the participants for all of the questions. I'm sorry we did not get to all of them. But I will say that after this, both Tahirih and Alliance Bernstein, we will be following up, providing information as to how you can follow up further. From the Tahirih side, that will be with Carrie Eisenberg, and then from the Alliance Bernstein, it will be myself, but you'll have our contact information in one email. And thank you everyone for your vibrant participation. Yeah. I
learned so much. It was just great. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
Take care, all of you. Thank you so much.